have the kind of respect to become a member of the scientific community and of the university scientific community to persuade his colleagues that he had something new to offer. And they were rejecting his ideas about seduction.
The abandonment of the seduction theory, like every other change that Freud made, was based on the analysis of his findings. He was constantly re-examining his material and his ideas and correlating theory and findings. This, of course, is the method of science. At first, in the situation and at the time that he was working, he believed the stories that his patients told him of their having been seduced by some older person who had already matured sexually, and that these were the basis of the traumatic memories that caused hysteria. It was natural for Freud to take these stories at face value, because at that particular time, it was believed that the sexual life of the individual began with puberty. Nonetheless, Freud's patients were telling him that they had sexual fantasies, sexual wishes during childhood. However could he explain this, except with the idea that something must have happened to stimulate these individuals, these patients, prematurely into sexuality. That is the result of some kind of seduction.
Why really should we care about something that seems like a rather remote historical question? Well, I think the answer is because analysts from the time of Freud on were convinced that Freud gave up the seduction hypothesis for purely scientific reasons. And once they believed this, his ideas became really doctrine within psychoanalysis and then spread to psychology and to psychiatry in general, so that his views about reality versus fantasy came to play an enormous role in our society. And they have been taken over from psychiatry and psychology more or less into the general population, so that we see this even in the judicial system when a woman is talking about rape or when a child is talking about having been abused. The first tendency is to believe that this may be nothing more than a fantasy. And ultimately, that derives from Freud.
Many of the controversies surrounding Freud have centered on the question of whether psychoanalysis is a science. Freud himself thought it had broader applications. In the years following his major publications on childhood sexuality, Freud applied psychoanalytic principles to religion, history, literature, and anthropology. He also had created a new model of the mind, the id, ego, and superego. These three forces represented the interplay of passion, rationality, and moral judgment. His ideas were so powerful that many intellectuals were drawn to psychoanalysis as a way to understand larger social and philosophical questions: war and peace, love and hate, religion and morality. Freud often spent his summers in the country outside of Vienna. He found comfort in spending time with his wife, their 6 children, and a loyal group of friends, including Princess Marie Bonaparte of Greece, whom Freud had analyzed. Initially, a small group of adventurous followers gathered around him, some famous, some not, but they attracted attention to Freud and the new field of psychoanalysis.
Freud was, for, let's say, the first 10 years of psychoanalytic practice, let us say from the middle 1890s to 1905, 1906, anything but famous. He may have exaggerated a little bit how isolated he was. He had admirers. By 1906, 1907, there were in fact even some rather distinguished professional admirers.
By 1911, an international association of analysts had grown up around Freud. Psychoanalysis was largely rejected by the traditional scientific community. These early analysts saw themselves at the forefront of a new intellectual movement, and they banded together against a hostile outside world. But there was also dissent within the group. Carl Jung, one of Freud's most ardent admirers, claimed that Freud had overemphasized the importance of childhood sexuality. And later, Karen Horney, another analyst, would charge that Freud had grossly misunderstood female psychology, a charge that was echoed throughout the coming years. World War I became a turning point in the history of psychoanalysis. Overnight, it gained wider credibility. Techniques derived from psychoanalysis were thought to be useful in treating soldiers who had been shell-shocked in battle. After World War I, European interest in Freudian methods grew. In Berlin, the first training institute was opened. In Vienna, a psychoanalytic clinic was started by members of the Vienna Society. These institutes were essential to the growth of psychoanalysis, but Frank Sulloway contends there was a price to be paid.
Freud and his followers took a very crucial step in the 1920s, approximately, when they decided to have their own institutes for training, and given hostility to psychoanalysis within the universities, to establish their own centers of learning and of training outside of universities. This essentially removes psychoanalysis from a 2,000-year tradition of criticism and growth of knowledge. And I think for Freud, it was a short-term gain. Psychoanalysis proliferated with its own teaching mechanisms, but it was a long-term disaster, I think.
The 1920s were an exciting time for psychoanalysis. Many analysts, like Franz Alexander of the Berlin Institute, would eventually leave Europe and spread psychoanalysis to America. A. Brill, an American analyst, had translated most of Freud's work into English. Ernest Jones, Freud's biographer, would help found the American Psychoanalytic Association. In Europe, psychoanalysis generally remained outside the medical and academic establishments, but in America, it would be different.
The American reception and interpretation of Freud was a very optimistic reception and interpretation. American analysts often believed that they could cure the most severe of neuroses, even psychoses, that they could treat, for example, schizophrenics. This was something that Freud had never felt. There was something about psychoanalysis that suggested to Americans as representatives of a new nation, of a frontier nation, a wonderful buoyant optimism about the mind and the kinds of things that doctors could do for the mind.
The press played a role in popularizing psychoanalysis, sometimes in a sensational way. By the 1930s, most Americans were at least familiar with Freud and his new psychology.
The magazines were interested in this sensational figure. There he was, this bearded Viennese doctor talking about sex all the time, so it seemed, encouraging promiscuity. He seemed to be just perfect for the 1920s and the age of Fitzgerald and so on. That this, of course, had nothing to do with the austerity of this doctrine was something that didn't bother the weeklies or even the newspapers at all.
Everybody was reading books about psychoanalysis and trying to understand their own problems in this way. And the psychiatrists accommodated themselves to this interest by concentrating themselves on psychoanalytic techniques. It was very well suited to the demands of private practice. Psychiatrists would only need to have a hotel room to practice in, and there seemed to be an endless demand for services for psychoanalytic treatment.
May I have your last name?
During World War II, American Army psychiatrists used a modified form of psychoanalysis in combination with other techniques to treat soldiers. In the 40s and 50s, there was an increased interest in psychotherapies, or talking therapies, which were based in psychoanalytic theory.
Now, I noticed in this history here that you saw a vision of your brother. Tell me something about that. What happened?
Oh, I guess it was a dream.
Well, describe the dream. What did you see in the dream?
I dreamt that I was home, my brother was home.
After the war, it was considered prestigious for psychiatrists to enhance their medical education with 6 to 10 years of additional training at an analytic institute.
You're telling me about.
Can you tell me what brought you here?
This introductory training film was made in 1962 by analysts from the Chicago Institute to demonstrate the proper methods of working with patients.
I don't know whether I need to be here or not, as a matter of fact. I've had a little trouble with jobs, but that's about all. Just
Analysts were taught the techniques of free association and transference. These techniques continued to distinguish psychoanalysis and analytically based therapies from the growing number of other talking therapies. Analysts believe, as did Freud, that an individual develops complex patterns of behavior early in life, and that these patterns inevitably surface in the analysis through the process of transference.
I get this feeling lately that you're critical of me, that you're hounding me, that you're down on me about something. So what did I do that was so bad? I don't know what brings this on. Over and over the same trouble. Now you. I don't know how to handle situations like this. I'm just stumped. I've been thinking maybe I better clear out. Maybe you and I ought to call this thing quits. And just like the jobs, just like my old man, I just had to get out of the family and forget about it.
During the 1950s and 60s, psychoanalysis was considered by many to be the preferred form of treatment for people with emotional problems. But it was expensive and lengthy. It required 4 to 5 sessions a week for at least 2 years. And even during a period of relative success, psychoanalysis was under attack. In 1952, an article appeared stating that the outcome for a patient undergoing analysis was no better than that of someone who had received no therapy. The article by the British behavioral psychologist Hans Eysenck was later refuted. But criticism like this challenged psychoanalysis to demonstrate its effectiveness through controlled scientific studies. For Freud, his patients confirmed his ideas. They provided him with the material to develop the theory of psychoanalysis, and what his patients revealed in their sessions proved its validity. Although Freud saw hundreds of patients, he only wrote extensive case histories on 12 of them. These 12 cases and the case study method became the foundation of psychoanalytic training. Today, many analysts still consider the case study method sufficient proof.
Freud's standard of proof was the conclusions that he could draw from the data that he got within the analytic situation while he was treating patients. This is the investigative tool of psychoanalysis. There is no way of drawing conclusions about psychoanalytic hypotheses if you leave out the data that you get from the analytic situation.
They're not proving anything by listening to patients confirm their expectations. This isn't proof or testing in a rigorous way. Psychoanalysis needs to get itself back into settings where it can be tested in experimental and extraclinical ways. It needs to take a hard look at areas of the theory that have been problematical, and it needs to go on. And I think the hardest thing is for the analysts themselves to do this. They don't have the kind of training or background to treat psychoanalysis as the kind of natural science it once was.
I think in part the attitude towards experimentation, this negative attitude, was, if the word fault is correct, Freud's own fault. But one might argue that the continuation of this attitude, to the extent that it persists, is the responsibility of those who don't cut themselves loose from Freud simply on the grounds that Freud himself had said this, and that's good enough for them. And we all know that that's not what would be called a scientific attitude, for sure.
The program committee has made
Although psychoanalysis was the original form of psychotherapy, it is among the least practiced today. The American Psychoanalytic Association, with its membership of 2,500, is small compared to the number of mental health professionals in this country. There is intense pressure on this community to prove the effectiveness of psychoanalysis. But providing proof is difficult. The length and private nature of the process do not lend themselves easily to scientific scrutiny. How then should psychoanalysis be assessed today? There are many differing views, including including those held by critics who are themselves analysts. Dr. Thomas Szasz.
Well, what Freud developed, what he contended that he developed, were really two interlocking systems. One, a theory of human behavior, both normal and abnormal, and a system of therapy, of treating, relieving mental diseases. Now, he felt that these were mutually confirmatory. In my view, so-called psychoanalytic theory